5 years ago, I finally walked away from a relationship that had consumed nearly a third of my life. We had been together for almost 10 years, starting out as wide-eyed teenagers in high school, navigating the chaos of college, and trying to build a life together afterward. There is a common romantic notion about high school sweethearts, but in reality, those relationships rarely survive the shift into true adulthood. People change too much. When it ended, I found myself facing a completely unfamiliar landscape. I had absolutely no clue how to date as an independent adult. So, I did what millions of others do. I downloaded a few popular dating apps, set up a profile, and started swiping. My first few attempts were incredibly discouraging. I went on a handful of dates with different women, but the conversations felt forced, the chemistry was non-existent, and they went absolutely nowhere. That all changed when I matched with Jami. Her legal name was Jamila, but she absolutely detested it, so she insisted everyone call her Jami. From our very first conversation, things felt different. Because we had both recently crawled out of long-term, emotionally exhausting relationships, we explicitly agreed to take things slow. Yet, not long after we officially became a couple, her behavior shifted in a way that caught me entirely off guard. She started asking me to sleep over at her apartment. Every single night, the invitation would come. At first, I politely declined. For me, spending the night at a new partner's place was a massive milestone, and given our agreement to pace ourselves, it felt too rushed. But she wouldn't drop it. The invitations became a daily, almost desperate plea. She even went so far as to tell me that I could sleep on the living room couch with the door closed if it made me feel more comfortable. Have you ever had a gut feeling that someone was hiding a deeper motive behind a simple request? Let me know in the comments below. Finally, after a week of this continuous pressure, I sat her down and asked her point blank why she was so desperate for me to stay the night. Jami instantly fell silent. Her posture stiffened, and a deep flush of embarrassment crept up her neck. She looked down at her hands, whispering that she didn't want to tell me the real reason because she was terrified of how I would react. She said it would mean the absolute world to her if I just trusted her and stayed. I told her I would only agree to stay if she was completely honest with me, and I gave her my solemn promise that I wouldn't judge her. That was a promise I was about to break in less than 2 minutes. Jami took a shaky breath and explained that for the past 3 weeks, her life had descended into a waking nightmare. She hadn't slept for more than an hour or two at a time. She explained that she would suddenly bolt upright in the dead of night, paralyzed by the overwhelming sensation that someone was standing in the far corner of her bedroom watching her sleep. Initially, she tried to rationalize it. Everyone knows that darkness has a cruel way of playing tricks on your eyes, stretching ordinary furniture into terrifying silhouettes. But every morning when the sun came up, she would examine that specific corner. It was completely empty. There wasn't a coat rack, a floor lamp, or a single piece of furniture in that trajectory that could cast a human-shaped shadow. As the weeks dragged on, her terror intensified. She told me that the fear had become so physically oppressive that she often found herself frozen in bed, too terrified to even reach for her phone or pull the blankets over her head. One night, in a desperate bid for safety, she decided to sleep on her living room couch. But when she woke up in the absolute darkness of the early morning hours, the exact same slender shadow figure was standing directly in the open doorway of the living room, looming over her. She wept as she confessed that she was genuinely convinced she was losing her mind. The night before our conversation, she had reached her breaking point. Waking up to see the figure in the bedroom corner again, she decided to prove to herself that it was just a hallucination. She grabbed a heavy stuffed animal from her headboard and hurled it directly at the darkness. But instead of the toy sailing through empty air and hitting the drywall, she watched in horror as it struck something solid. The shadow figure actually absorbed the impact and shifted its weight slightly. Part of me felt incredibly cruel because she was actively sobbing, trembling right in front of me. But I have a deeply ingrained, terrible defense mechanism. Whenever I am faced with intense, awkward emotions or serious situations, I instinctively resort to humor. It's a bad habit, and in this moment, it failed spectacularly. I let out a small chuckle and told her that it sounded like she was dealing with the classic monster under the bed. The comment cut her deeply. The sorrow on her face immediately turned to bitter disappointment. She snapped at me, saying that this exact reaction was why she had been so terrified to tell me in the first place. She knew I would just write her off as crazy. I immediately tried to backtrack. I told her I didn't think she was insane, but insisted there had to be a completely logical medical explanation for what she was experiencing. I suggested she was suffering from a severe case of sleep paralysis. I remembered reading articles online about people who experienced vivid, terrifying hallucinations of shadow people while locked in a state of semi-consciousness. But Jami adamantly shook her head. She knew what sleep paralysis was, and she insisted this wasn't it. She was fully mobile when it happened. She had thrown the toy. Desperate to offer some kind of practical advice, I told her to just try sleeping with the overhead lights turned on. My logic was simple. If the room was flooded with bright light, a shadow monster physically couldn't form. Jami looked at me with hollow, exhausted eyes. She told me she had already tried that, and when she left the lights on, the shadow didn't appear in the corner. Instead, she watched the closet door slowly, silently crack open on its own, and the entity stood frozen inside the darkness of the closet, peering out at her through the gap. I hate to admit it, and I know it makes me sound like an incredibly insensitive jerk, but at that exact moment, I genuinely believed Jami was suffering from some kind of psychological breakdown. It wasn't that I thought she was lying to me. I just fundamentally did not believe in supernatural entities or shadow monsters. In my worldview, there is a rational, scientific explanation for absolutely everything. Hoping to do some immediate damage control for my stupid monster under the bed comment, I swallowed my skepticism and agreed to stay over at her apartment that very night. By the time 8 p.m. rolled around, we were sitting on her living room couch with a movie playing on the television. Jami didn't even make it through the first 20 minutes. She was so profoundly, utterly exhausted from weeks of sleep deprivation that she completely blacked out. She was dead to the world, stretched out fully across the cushions, her head resting near my lap. I sat there quietly, watching the movie and gently running my fingers through her hair, glad that she was finally getting some peace. A few hours ticked by, and the clock crept well past midnight. My own eyelids began to feel incredibly heavy. I didn't want to risk waking her up by trying to move her to the bedroom, so I used the remote to turn off the television, plunging the apartment into thick, heavy darkness. I leaned back against the upright armrest of the couch, closed my eyes, and eventually drifted off into a restless sleep. I don't know what time it was when the nightmare began. I was suddenly jolted awake by Jami shaking my shoulder violently. The apartment was freezing cold. I opened my eyes and looked at her. Even in the dim light filtering through the window blinds, I could see that her face was completely pale, her eyes wide with a level of primal terror I had never witnessed in another human being. She didn't say a word. She just pointed a trembling finger toward the far side of the room, directly at the open doorway that led into her home office. I squinted into the gloom, my vision adjusting to the dark. And then, my heart dropped into my stomach. There, standing perfectly still within the frame of the doorway, was a distinct, human-shaped mass of absolute blackness. It was darker than the night around it, a solid silhouette that seemed to absorb what little ambient light entered the apartment. My immediate survival instinct kicked in, and I started to shift my weight to stand up and confront whoever had broken into the apartment. But the moment I moved, Jami threw her entire body weight over my arm, gripping me with terrifying strength, silently begging me with her eyes to stay completely still. I felt an overwhelming surge of adrenaline mixed with pure absurdity. I broke the silence and began shouting at the top of my lungs at the shape, demanding to know who they were and telling them to get out. It felt completely insane. Literally like I was just screaming at an empty, dark doorway. Jami began to weep hysterically beside me, whispering through her tears that because I could see it too, it meant she wasn't crazy. It meant it was real. She told me that a sick part of her had been praying she was just losing her mind, because the alternative was infinitely worse. I stubbornly refused to accept the supernatural. I told her it wasn't a ghost or an entity, and told her to let go of my arm so I could go over there, flip the light switch, and prove to her that it was nothing more than an optical illusion. But she held on to me like a vice, her fingernails digging into my skin. "What does it do next?" I whispered frantically, eyes locked on the silhouette. "Nothing," she sobbed. "It just stands there. It just watches." At the time, my frustration and ignorance overrode my fear. The entire situation felt entirely ridiculous to me. If this thing was real, but it just stood there without moving, attacking, or speaking, then why were we letting it terrorize us? I decided to take matters into my own hands. I reached down with my free hand, grabbed a heavy, dense decorative throw pillow from the edge of the couch, and prepared to hurl it across the room. My logical brain was still trying to convince me that the pillow would simply sail through the doorway and hit the floor inside the office, proving the shadow was just a trick of the light. Right as I cocked my arm back, Jami realized what I was doing and tried to pull my arm down. She frantically reminded me that she had thrown something at it before, and it had moved. She begged me not to provoke it. But I needed to see it for myself. I needed an answer. I broke away from her grip and threw the pillow as hard as I humanly could straight at the shadowy doorframe. I expected to see the fabric fly through the darkness. Instead, a split second later, a loud, solid thud echoed through the apartment. The pillow didn't go through the doorway. It slammed into the midsection of the solid black mass, deflected off it, and dropped heavily to the carpet. What would you have done in this moment? Would you have stayed on the couch or investigated? Tell me your survival strategy in the comments. Immediately after the impact, the shadow figure did not fall. Instead, it fluidly, slowly stepped backward into the pitch-black office, disappearing completely from our line of sight. For the first time in my life, I froze in absolute, unadulterated terror. My mind was completely incapable of processing what I had just witnessed. Jami completely broke down, screaming and crying hysterically on the couch, her worst fears validated in the worst possible way. Adrenaline completely took over. Ignoring her screams for me to come back, I pulled myself off the couch and slowly, cautiously advanced toward the pitch-black doorway. When I reached the threshold of the office, I didn't dare step inside immediately. I stood perfectly still, straining my ears. From the deep darkness of the room, I heard it. It was a faint, raspy, hurried whisper. I leaned in closer, desperate to comprehend what was being said, but I couldn't decipher any actual words. It was just the unmistakable, terrifying sound of human breath forming spoken syllables in the dark. As I finally gathered the courage to take a physical step across the threshold, the heavy wooden office door suddenly slammed violently shut right in my face. The sheer force of the air and the impact caused me to stumble backward, falling hard onto the living room floor. Behind me, Jami's screams reached a deafening crescendo. I scrambled back to my feet, grabbed the brass doorknob, and twisted it. It wouldn't budge. The door had been locked from the inside. Instantly, the quiet apartment was filled with the chaotic sound of heavy objects being violently thrown, shattered, and dragged across the floor on the other side of the wood. It sounded like a literal localized tornado had been unleashed inside the small office. Bookshelves were tipping over. Glass was breaking. I stood there paralyzed, listening to the destruction for a solid 30 seconds. And then, just as abruptly as it started, everything went dead silent. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. I ran over to the living room light switch and flipped it, flooding the space with bright, glaring light. I dashed over to my overnight bag resting by the couch and scrambled through the pockets to find my keychain. Attached to it was a small, rigid tension tool and a rake pick that I kept around as a hobbyist lockpicker. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely function, but I forced myself to insert the tools into the simple privacy lock of the office door. Within 10 seconds, I heard a satisfying click. I threw the door open and immediately slapped the light switch on the wall. The room was in absolute, catastrophic ruins, Jami used this space as her dedicated home office. It had featured a heavy wooden desk, a desktop computer, a tall bookcase, and hundreds of research books and neatly filed legal paperwork. Now, every single piece of furniture was overturned. The books had been violently ripped from their shelves, pages torn out, and papers scattered across every square inch of the floor like a carpet of debris. It looked like a bomb had detonated. But two specific details caught my attention immediately. First, the large glass window at the back of the office was thrown wide open, and the exterior mesh screen had been completely ripped away from the frame. Second, and most importantly, there was no shadow figure, nor any human being, anywhere to be found in the room. Jami was still screaming my name from the living room, begging to know if I was alive. I walked back out, my face entirely blank, and told her that the entity was gone, but the room was completely destroyed. I immediately suggested calling the police, but Jami shook her head frantically, weeping that the police couldn't arrest a demon or a ghost. She was utterly convinced it was a paranormal assault. I didn't know what to believe. I was profoundly shaken in the moment, but as the minutes ticked by and the immediate threat passed, my rational brain desperately tried to claw its way back to reality. I allowed her to talk me out of calling the authorities. Instead, I spent the remaining hours of the night helping her silently clean up the wreckage of her office. Jami didn't spend another night in that apartment for a long time. She stayed at my place for the next 2 weeks. When we finally gathered the courage to return to her apartment together, I made sure to stay over every single night. The shadow figure never returned. Months later, when she finally had to spend her first night alone there again, she slept completely through the night without a single incident. It has been exactly 5 years since that night. Jami and I are now happily engaged, but to this day, we still constantly clash over what actually happened. She remains steadfast in her belief that she was targeted by a malevolent supernatural entity. I, on the other hand, remain utterly convinced that it wasn't a ghost. But the one thing we do agree on, the terrifying truth we both have to live with, is that whatever it was physically there. I witnessed it with my own eyes, felt the impact of the pillow, and heard the locked door slam shut. As the years pass, I often lie awake at night and ask myself a terrifying question. What is truly worse? The thought that my fiancé was being haunted by a terrifying supernatural shadow monster, or the thought that a highly disturbed flesh and blood human being had successfully broken into her apartment, discovered a way to conceal themselves in the dark, and spent weeks standing in the corner of her room, silently watching her sleep. Either way, I am profoundly grateful that it never happened again. At least, not yet.